So I've done a tier list before about the antagonists in Chronicles of Darkness, but those were specifically the ones that were the player splat antagonist, as opposed to antagonists with their own subtype or splat. So let's delve into that right now. Like before, I'll put a link to this in the description below, but let's first go off of ghosts. Now, ghosts are your generic ephemeral entities. They don't have much special. They have to anchor to an object or person. Specifically, they usually anchor to their corpse or where they died. I like them. They're perfectly fine antagonist or thing to throw at your players. And they do exist in Twilight, which means they're invisible unless they manifest themselves. Invisible and untouchable unless they manifest themselves. Spirits are very similar. I actually like them a little bit more than ghosts, because ghosts are specifically tied to a person or creature dying, whereas a spirit is specifically tied to any sort of strong emotion or representation of an object in the shadow. It's very good for a werewolf game. It's all right for everything else, which is why it's one of my favorites. Now, angels are very interesting because when Chronicles of Darkness first started out, Angels of the God Machine were a thing, but their rules weren't really set in stone yet. Because demons are actually fallen angels, demons have cover, but for some reason, because angels were created earlier probably, angels don't have cover. Instead, they're ephemeral entities like ghosts and spirits, and there's a lot of wonkiness with angel rules because of this, but I will say angels are still creatures I like, and I do have some homebrew rules that put them up to my favorites. Next up, we have the generic horrors, which were part of Chronicles of Darkness initially, which are essentially your generic monster making rules. You're not considered a horror in game terms. Usually you're considered whatever you're trying to represent. So you can make a vampire with the horror rules and you'd still call it a vampire, but it's just a generic tool set so that the GM has something to work with to put up against the players. So I think I like them. They're not anything special, but they are definitely something that I like to use and throw out my players. Now the Strix, as far as a vampire antagonist goes, I'm very mixed on, because they have a weird ephemeral type ability. They're shadow creatures, or shadow owls specifically. And what this means is if they're not possessing a body or an object or something, they are untouchable, similar to being a ghost or a spirit. But they are very interesting in that they are mirrors of vampires. Instead of drinking blood, they drink life essence from people. Like, I know I sound a little wishy-washy on them, but they are one of my favorite creatures to use, just because in lore it is specifically called out that they are nearly identical to vampires when it comes to their aura. And when you can have confusion of a mage or someone not realizing that they're going up against a Strix versus a vampire, it's really fun for me. Werewolf the Forsaken has a few interesting characters. The ones that I specifically want to call out here are the Host. They are shards of spirit gods from Pangea back when Father Wolf was around, and they're trying to rebuild themselves and become spirit gods, essentially. I really, really like these ones. I'm not sure if I put them in my favorite, but I do tend to use them a lot. If I were to organize these all into like my personal favorites, maybe I put the Host just above the Angels as far as in the like it category. Hosts can be like creatures or animals in their representation, but they possess a person and then fill that person's body with more of themselves. Like they start using it to reproduce until they get killed, and then they explode, and little shards of the spirit god in the form of like ants or rats or spiders or things go crawling around, and you have to kill them before they can get to a mortal and infect them. Next up, we have the Idigam, who are spirits from the moon, from outer space, kind of. They came to Earth during the moon landing. They kind of hitched a ride on it, and sometimes probably come down to Earth through asteroids or things. They're formless spirits that change their ban and bane and their influence, I believe. And they can be a bit difficult to deal with because you might figure out what their ban or bane is, and then it just changes randomly. you want to make them, I think it's consolidate or coagulate or something, I forget the term, but a solidified form that has a set ban and bane, and they're a lot easier to deal with. But they also do a lot of crazy things, like create hollowed werewolves or something, like werewolves who are basically the Indigam's puppets. I've not used them, so I don't have much to say about them, but they do seem pretty interesting. Mage the Awakening, we have the Abyssals. I want to like them, but they don't have rules. And people will say, oh, their influence is paradox, but that's not in the rules anywhere, and it's kind of like a band-aid on the fact that a lot of Mage the Awakening antagonists aren't really fleshed out. There's an entire book of abyssal creatures that you can fight, but there's no universal like thing that says what an abyssal has access to, because they're kind of like chaos creatures of magic that are from the abyss and feed off of paradox, but you don't see mechanically what feeding off of paradox looks like. Someone explain abyssals to me, because I've never seen them be a threat to a mage. Next up, we have supernal entities. Now, supernal entities I do kind of like. You can summon them as a mage. They are creatures that are representative of the 5 supernal realms, and you can ask them questions, usually to get information that you would otherwise not be able to. Nothing's wrong to say about them. I will put them slightly above ghosts. They're interesting. I just haven't really gotten the hang of them yet, probably. Goetia, again, I'm going to say I don't understand Goetia. Goetia are basically ephemeral entities from the astral. I guess I don't do astral games a lot, so I don't see the appeal, but essentially Goetia are creatures that were created through the human subconscious in the astral, or people who have dreamed up them or things like that. So that's kind of why they're here. Going on to Promethean the Created, we have the Qashmal, which are the blue fairy type creatures, if you're familiar with Pinocchio. They are representatives of the principle, which is where the Azoth and Pyros comes for Prometheans, and their whole deal is that they try to get Prometheans to go through the pilgrimage so that the principle gets the Azoth back. They are ones that I haven't really tried. I tried them once. They use the same rules as angels, which, again, I wish there was a way that they stood out from normal angels as opposed to just using the generic angel rules. Pandorans, I love them. They're my favorite antagonist to use that is hyper specific to a splat. Specifically, they are, and I'll put them above Strix. No, I'll even put them above spirits. They are failed Prometheans that feed off of Pyros and vitriol that Prometheans generate. They'll turn into statues until a Promethean comes by, and then they'll feed on the Promethean. Now, they're very interesting in that regard, but I have used them a lot because I love their rules for fighting. Their dread powers are really awesome. There are a lot of subcategories of them too. Some of them feed off of other things besides Pyros, and others will gain enough from feeding that they actually become sentient and can be wheeling and dealing, as it were. Oh my god, Changeling the Lost has a crap ton of antagonist splats. We'll start with the True Fae. I kind of like them. I'll put them on par with angels for me, but really they're kind of an endgame boss, and you don't want to face them in Arcadia, and probably don't want to face them in the Hedge either. You really want to get them out into the mortal plane where they're a lot weaker, but also they have very highly specific rules for actually killing them permanently, because True Fae are linked to their title, which means that so long as the title exists, they'll always come back. So the Huntsman of the North or something, or not the Huntsman, but the Woodsman of the North or something like that as a title would mean that that True Fae, when it dies, so long as that title still exists, that there's this Woodsman to the North, they'll come back. It's usually given through the weird, in this weird quest thing that they do. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Just know that they're always going to exist in a Changeling the Lost game, but you don't always have to use them. Fetches, on the other hand, are really good to use. They are created by the True Fae when they take a mortal from the mortal plane and turn them into a changeling. Typically, a fetch will try and be a doppelganger for the person who was taken, and they might not know that they're a fetch. Some of them do, some of them don't. They're very cool for specifically changeling games, but they're not that great in other games because they're supernatural creatures, but they're specifically tied to changelings. I'd put them in favorite under Strix, I think, just because they're so hyper specific. Goblin Queens are specifically changelings who have accrued a lot of goblin debt, so much so that they've turned into a hobgoblin. I would have put this into antagonist splat territory, and I don't actually remember, but I might not have because you can transfer the condition to other people. Not sure where I'll put them in because I have not tried them. So I'll put them in, have not tried. Hedge Ghosts. Hedge Ghosts are basically like ghosts, except they don't have a twilight form. They're ephemeral entities that live in the hedge. They don't necessarily need to be a person or have been a person, but they do have, they can be created through tokens, objects, memories, things that just sort of gut up the hedge's inner workings. So you have like an object that has a lot of importance to you in the hedge. It might like roll down a hill and start attracting other objects of a similar type and turn into this hedge spirit of agony or something like that. Haven't used them a lot in the way that they're supposed to be used, but I'll put them in like it, and I'll put them a little bit under horror just because, again, they're hyper specific to the hedge, and not all games are going to go to the hedge. Hedge Beasts are kind of cool creatures to throw at players. They are basically hobgoblins, which I'll go into in a second, but they're your native creatures to the hedge. Not much more to say about them. They do have their own weird abilities. I'm going to say like it, and I'll put them a little bit higher than supernal creatures. Hobgoblins, same way. They are just sentient hedge beasts. They have intelligence, and they can make deals. Specifically, actually, I'll put them above hedge beasts because they can make deals with players, and that's where you can accrue a lot of goblin debt. Goblin debt being you get a really cool item, but when you use it, you keep accruing this debt that is going to that needs to be paid off in some way to the hobgoblin that gave you the object in the first place, or to even the object itself, I think. Huntsmen are the right-hand man of the True Fae. They are creatures that live in Acadia and are actually Arcadia. I say Acadia like it's Maine. They live in Arcadia. They're native to it, probably. And they have this interesting thing that when they are given a title by a True Fae, they are able to wield cold iron weapons without taking aggravated damage from holding them. They are not affected by iron at all, but they still use the goblin template. And they have a lot of interesting ways to deal with changelings, and their just appeal is really good. Again, they're hyper specific to changeling, but I think I like them even better than the True Fae. No, I even like them more than the Fetch. I'll put them under the Strix. I have to say that the character art that they have for this, I don't know if you can see it that well. It's Van Pelt from Jumanji. That is what the Huntsmen are. Geist the Sin Eater has a lot of subtypes of ghosts. So first off, we have the Kerberoi, who are very interesting in their own way. They live in the underworld, and they are in the lower part of it where they lead the cities. And there are old laws that keep the cities afloat. And if anyone breaks the old laws, the Kerberoi know that it happened, and they'll try and punish the person who broke the law. Now, I'd say I like them better than normal ghosts. However, they are tied specifically to the underworld, so much so that I'm not really that. They really fit the theme, but they're not my thing. I'll put them above Abyssals a little bit because I can see using them in a game, but they're just so hyper specific. I can't think of ever using them. Similarly, the Reapers are ghosts that are rank 2 that have found death masks in the underworld or somewhere else that were created when a Geist died or was discorporated or something, I forget. Like, it's the remnants of a Geist or a remnant of a very powerful being. They put the death mask on and they become this avatar of the chthonic gods in the underworld, the creatures that created the underworld. And they're told one mission, which is bring ghosts from the material plane back to the underworld. I like them a lot better than normal ghosts because they have a lot more to them than ghosts, but that's just the benefit of having them be a subtype of ghost. Uh, I'm gonna put them above ghosts just because I like them for their flavor. They're very Huntsman like, but they're specifically tied to Geists. Monsters are a template from Hunter the Vigil, and they're just horrors with a little bit better rules. They have more they have more dread powers in Hunter the Vigil, and so that's why I just put them a little bit above horrors. I think I put them, like, they don't have the lore implications of some of these creatures, but I'll put them above under Hobgoblins in front of Hedge Beasts, because they're just sort of a sandbox for the GM to play in. Now we get to some interesting ones. You have Mummy the Curse with the Amkhata, who are chimeric-like ephemeral creatures that feed off of Sekem. They are very interesting, and in fact, I will say they are one of my favorite creatures to use just because of how cool the idea of them is, and their abilities are tied to what animal shape their like different body parts are. I will say, however, they aren't that great. They're a little bit better than fetches, but because they're not hyper specific to Mummy, like you can technically use them in other game lines if you're smart about it, because Sekem is just sort of like a generic life force that builds up in places, so they're kind of like haunting different areas, so they can be mistaken for ghosts and spirits. The thing I would say though about Amkhata are the rules to make them can be very difficult for people who are new to the game to figure out, because they look like ephemeral creatures, but then they have like this dot cost to their different body parts, which can affect the cost, the amount of merits or dread powers they have access to. The Avatar slash Benbenet are an interesting one that I'm not sold on at all, really. From what I understand, Mummy the Curse judges are always in the background. They're not usually at the forefront. The mummies have always kind of been the representatives of the judges in Mummy the Curse. But in this instance, one mortal person is given the avatar power of the judge. They channel the judge's might in order to directly affect the world. And that's not sort of how judges act, I think. Some people have said in the past that they sound very similar to the avatars that the Exarchs could use in Mage the Awakening. And I kind of feel like there's a little bit of bleed in with that. The Fiends are not, they don't have rules technically in Mummy the Curse 2nd edition, but they do get like a little side box that explains how they kind of work. They're ephemeral entities very similar to Amkhata or angels, but they live in Duat, which is the area that mummies go to when they die or they're asleep waiting to be awoken. Or when they arise, rather. And fiends live in Duat, but if someone draws a picture of them in the material plane, they can be summoned pretty easily. Fiends are pretty potent creatures to bring about into the material plane and are very dangerous. I kind of like them, but I did try them myself. I will say I like them about as much as angels, so right below angels. Next up, we have cryptids, which are one of my favorite Demon the Descent splat types or antagonist types. I put them right above Amkhata The thing is cryptids are creatures that fell into God Machine infrastructure, but they're not required to, like, they don't need to be near the God Machine infrastructure. They can wander off and do their own thing. And one of the example ones they have in the book is a demon dog. If you were to just put that into a random chronicle with mortals, they would think it's actually a demon dog. They would not think that it is some creature that fell into God Machine infrastructure. And that's kind of the point. They can be generic monsters with cool abilities, and they have a cool origin if your players can figure it out. Heroes are an interesting one because you'd think heroes only hunt beasts from Beasts the Primordial, but actually heroes can be used to hunt normal supernatural types all the time. They can create what are known as, I forget if it's called posses. It might be posses, but basically they can create a group of hunters to go hunt down creatures and give benefits to them. So it's quite possible that as a vampire you might run into a hero, and some of the abilities I think heroes get access to allow them to apply anathema to other supernaturals besides beasts. That might just be my own flavor or homebrew, but I really like doing it because it adds this extra level of severity that heroes can provide. And actually, they'd be a great antagonist for mages because heroes could basically make it so that the hunters can see mages and give them bonuses, while at the same time, anathema is forcing a ban and bane onto a creature. So if the hero says that as a witch you cannot swim, or that you'll melt by water, suddenly you have the bane of water and it's raining and your skin starts to burn. It's a very cool enemy to use. I know a lot of people gave it flack back when it was first started, but I'll put them around the Huntsman and Cryptid area. I think the main thing that issue that people have with heroes is that they're supposed to be low integrity humans. And that can cause a lot of problems where they're just like the worst of the worst people, even though they're called heroes. That can, like, I always ignore that though. I'm like, there can be a hero who's misguided, and that's more interesting than a hero who actively knows that they are the villain. Lastly, we have the manticores, which I don't ever plan on using. Manticores are essentially deviants, but animals. They were creatures that were experimented on and turned into deviants. I don't believe there are any rules for them, like, specifically. However, it is said that manticores are likely creatures, like, they probably have used the creature stat line or something and then have instability thrown onto them, as well as the variations, or whatever they're called, the abilities that deviants have. So I don't ever really plan on using them. And if I were to use them as a concept, I probably use something like Cryptid, or even like the generic monster rules to represent them. If you want to help support the channel, I just put out a book called Bloody Burrows with a bunch of other StoryPath Nexus creators and even some Onyx Path freelancers, so please check it out. Additionally, if you'd like to check out a preview of an urban horror game that is kind of more creepypasta-like, check out Curseborn over here. I managed to get my hands on some promo material that I probably shouldn't have been able to get my hands on. Shout out to our patrons for supporting the channel.